Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's for I think this is our fourth town hall. This will be our last one before the summer. We're going to get the town halls going again in September and then November. Those dates will be announced before we hit the summer. But this is our last town hall before summer. So glad you're here. Want to let you know that we have a place here. I've got my handy dandy little tote, and it's got a card for questions and a pen, so that if you have questions during the time that we're together, please write those down and we'll collect those at the end. Because what we want to do here is make sure that we're not only presenting the information of what's coming down, what's happening in the future, but also make sure that we're addressing your concerns. So let me pass it on this side too, Bob. You can kind of just pass it back. Right, but before we get going, let me say a prayer for us, and then I'll turn it over to Adam. So Lord, we say thank you for this day. Thank you for visiting us in worship, Lord, and thank you for visiting us here. God, and lead us as we steward the resources and steward everything that you've given this church for the future. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Good afternoon. My name's Adam Broom, and I'm serving as chair of church council this year, and I'm here to talk to you about the generosity audit. And my immediate reaction when I heard that term for the first time was, what in the world is a generosity audit? But we'll talk about that in a moment. So I'd like to talk about the engagement of Generis, the firm that we hired recently to do the generosity audit, and then talk about what the generosity audit is. And the reason we hired Generis was the sense that we could use the benefit from some experienced advice from a professional firm that had experience in working with churches and helping to develop a culture of generosity. And I say generosity intentionally, as we've learned in the course of working with Generis. Stewardship is management of resources. Generosity is giving generously, both and living generously in all ways as a Christian. So there was a sense in that we needed to look at changes in giving over for the long term. We've had there's been changes in electronic giving and online giving. There's a tendency in recent years for people to pledge less often than in the past, which makes budgeting a bit more challenging in many respects. There has been greater variability in recent years in giving. We were up a bit in 2017, down a bit in 2018. I think we're doing well this year, but that remains to be seen as we move on in the year. There was a bit of confusion, perhaps, when we shifted to a different fiscal year. We'd been reporting financially on a calendar year basis, and now we're going to be reporting starting July 1st on a July 1st to June 30 basis, which better aligns with our ministry and program year. But as a result, we sort of had a low-key campaign in the fall. We were planning to have a bigger campaign in the spring for an annual campaign. We've pushed that off now for the time being for a variety of reasons. But the sense was we could benefit now from some outside advice. Mike Saunders, our Minister of Administration, explained it well, I thought. He said, it's like when you're editing your own document on word processing. You write a document in the word processor, you edit it, you review it, and you're sure it's just fine, but you give it to somebody else and they look at it and they point out a lot of things that you can't see because it's your own document. Well, we could benefit from having some outside advice from someone who is taking a fresh look at what we do. So the Finance Committee approved hiring Generis for a limited engagement, what they call a generosity audit. It's a $3,500 fee all in, and it was to include a one-day visit, which the Generis consultant, Alan Wiles, came and visited us April 14th and 15th, met with clergy, staff, leadership, perspective groups that were selected to include a range of perspectives on the church and our giving climate. The objective was to assess our giving climate to see what's working, what's not working, to help identify new opportunities for promoting and enhancing a culture of generosity at our church. Apart from the on-site meetings that they held in mid-April, the church office uploaded our historical giving data to the Generis analytics system, which encountered a little bit of challenge because our realm system that we now use for our church financial management. Is relatively new, and so there was a bit of a hiccup in trying to get the data fields from our realm system into their system, but they're about to finish, working through those issues now. In any event, the deliverables included an audit report, and I just received the preliminary copy of the text part of that audit report yesterday afternoon about 5 o'clock, so this is hot off the presses. The financial report based upon the financial analytics using the system that Generis has is still a work in process because of the delay in getting the data mapping resolved, but that should be to us soon, we hope. So my comments I want to just point out on this system. I'm going to be talking about selected highlights. I say system, I meant the report. My comments on the audit report, these are selected highlights. It's an 11-page single-space report. And this is my perspective. I haven't had a chance to talk with others on church council or the clergy or the like, so this is just what I'm picking out of the report, and others may see other aspects that seem important to them. But I want to give you a sense of what Generis is telling us about our giving climate and opportunities for improvement and how they recommend we proceed. So they did find that we are a healthy church. We have the opportunity, the possibility of becoming a church full of radically generous members. And there's a sense of momentum at our church and excitement and a sense of anticipation that, they note that we're struggling a bit with, I think, what they referred to as denominational polity, which is a word that's bigger than my vocabulary, but I think it was talking about the way forward and the traditional plan and those issues that we're struggling with as a denomination. But notwithstanding that, they found that in their meetings there was a high sense of excitement and anticipation about the future as we try to build upon the past but look toward the future and continue to grow our church. They did find and commented several times in the report that we have a strong and capable clergy and staff, and our laity has great confidence in our clergy and staff and in church leadership generally, but that there was these were key indicators of a healthy church and gave us a lot of great foundation on which to look forward to the future that many churches do not enjoy. So they're telling us that we're in a great place to move forward successfully. They also commented that in one of the observations that the senior pastor is highly valued. We all know that. Justin is highly valued. He's on his second tour of duty with us, having been here as an associate pastor in the past. And we all love Justin and cherish him. But they commented that Justin has a strong desire to lead us to a new culture of living generously as Christians and to raise us up to another level. And it was critical that as to how we leverage that leadership in successfully transitioning to the next phase. So I thought about that last night and this morning, and it finally dawned on me what they're saying, and to me, is that we need to let Justin lead us through this next phase. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward, that Justin, we need to take advantage of the value we place on his leadership and our respect for him, and let him lead us in this next phase. The other observations they commented were that there was some change, the confusion around the fiscal year change that needs to be addressed. People weren't sure, am I giving for this bridge period of 6 months? Am I giving for the calendar year of 2019? What exactly am I giving for? And so there was some confusion, and it showed up in fewer pledges being submitted, though people continue to give, even though they may not have pledged, they continue to give. So the giving is still there, but the change in the financial reporting caused a bit of confusion. Now, one thing that Generis is suggesting is that we keep our giving hat in terms of the calendar year, that as we continue with fall campaigns, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and not try to do a spring campaign, but continue with fall campaigns, because people tend to think about planning their giving on a calendar year basis, and typically in the fall for the next calendar year. So we'll be doing reporting for financial purposes on a ministry year basis, that is July 1 to June 30, but we'll be doing our generosity campaign on a traditional fall campaign basis. At least that's Generis' recommendation, and I expect we'll follow it. They did notice repeatedly in the report that there was a uniform sense of desire for more missions. Everyone wants to have more people involved in doing missions and ministries, particularly external missions, to reach out to outside the church. There's also a desire to have a generous, just a generous church overall, but we're lacking a game plan. That's my reminder to keep it going. We're lacking a game plan, and we need a game plan. We have a good communication systems, but we can improve in our communications to let people know more about the life-changing work that's being done in the church and our vision for the future. And we need to have a bit more clarity about what our vision for the future is. So Generis has recommended that we proceed with what they would call an intentional generosity plan. And what that would look like in terms of highlights is over the next 9 months, which they were suggesting May to January of next year, we engage in a specific and fairly detailed in their plan document, plan of activities that might be termed an everyday generosity plan, using preaching and teaching and celebration and modeling. That we build a series of activities that start in the summer and culminate in the fall with a campaign that's oriented toward the operating budget of the church in terms of everyday needs. When I say preaching, teaching, celebrating, and modeling, that's they noted that we as a congregation want to hear more about generosity on Sunday sermons and otherwise. Teaching-wise, we need to do more to teach generosity as an element of discipleship in our Sunday school classes and to new members, to offer opportunities to families on financial topics and the like, and they encourage us to do that through teaching. Celebration is part of the communications element that we need to do more about celebrating both in worship and in communications through online media and otherwise, celebrating the work that's being done through our church. We have to connect the dots, to connect the dollars being given to the work that's being done so that people know that the dollars are going for good use as they are. And then modeling, we need to encourage our church council members and others involved in leadership in the church to model living generously. And that's living generously in all ways, through our prayers, our service, our gifts, our witness. And we also need to consider planning a capital campaign. Jim Buterbaugh, as chair of trustees, will be talking in a moment about the facility needs, and we'll at some point need to consider a capital campaign to fund those. Generis suggested that we consider raising, planning a capital campaign and possibly combining the fall everyday campaign with a capital campaign, so it'd be one commitment card and we commit to both goals at the same time, what Generis refers to as a one-fund campaign. Now, I won't go into the detailed plans. The Generis plan document we got yesterday has detailed plans for and suggestions regarding leadership and communications, worship activities, the fall campaign, all sorts of things in there, but it's fairly detailed, and we'll need to digest that as we go forward. So our next steps from a stewardship, which I should say instead, generosity standpoint, is to digest these recommendations, get the financial analysis, and digest those as well. And we also need to form or reform our stewardship team, which I suspect we'll start calling a generosity team, but that remains to be determined. This is, like I said, hot off the presses. We have had a stewardship team, still have a stewardship team. We're looking for a new stewardship team leader to work with the finance committee to help implement this work. But we'll need more than that. This will be a broader generosity team, at least as recommended by Generis. So we'll need to figure out how to pull that team together. And then that team, and along with the rest of us here and the rest of the church, will need to figure out how to define and implement this generosity plan going forward. So that's all I have to offer today on the generosity plan, except that we don't have to wait for the plan to be defined and developed. You can already start today living and giving generously. So thank you.
Thanks, Adam. As Adam mentioned, my name's Jim Booterball, and I'm chair of trustees. And at our last meeting, I said that trustees were going to be represented at the next town hall, and I gave everybody on the committee the opportunity to step up and say that they would do the presentation. And I said, anybody? And they said, no, Jim, as chair, we think you ought to do it. And so I'm speaking on behalf of the whole committee, and we have a great trustees group. It's just such a blessing to be involved with the group, and at the end of each year we celebrate how much fun it is to be on trustees. And so anyway, we want to talk about facilities master plan. And what happens with the trustees is we'll always be thinking about where our challenges are with the facility. Okay, so and I know that you can think of challenges right now that come up with the facility, and probably one of the first things that will come to your mind are bathrooms. Justin talked about them today in his sermon, right? And believe it or not, there has been a plan to put bathrooms in the back of the in the back of the sanctuary here, and it would go out into the courtyard, and this was done years and years ago. And as I found out on trustees, there are plans to do a lot of things. There have been plans that have been done to do some things out in the courtyard here, maybe in terms of a fellowship hall, and there have been plans to do several different things, and we haven't done them. But there have been a few things that we've done over the past couple years, and so as our history, some of the things that we've done over the past couple years is regarding the chapel. And as you recall, the chapel used to have the fixed pews in there, and it was a single-use room, and it was fine for being a chapel, but we only used it a couple percent of the time. So we were having space limitations, and so that was one of the things that we said, well, we need to make this a more multifunctional room. So the pews were removed. A partition was put up so we could have two meeting spaces in there, and that solved a short-term problem. But we said, does this really fit into the long-range plans? Well, we don't know, because we don't have a long-range plan. But whatever we're doing, we're going to do it so we can undo it later on. So we did that, and then Wesley came to us, Wesley Foundation, and said, we'd like to use your chapel on Sunday nights, but we'd like to have a worship service in there, and it's really not right for a worship service. So in order to make it right for a worship service, we further modified it to change the lighting in there and to put a little stage up there and to put some TV screens in there so it would work short term for their type of service, and it did okay. But does it fit the long-range plan? I don't know. We don't have a long-range plan. All right, but it's working okay, and whatever we've done can be altered later. Well, then we came a couple years ago to another challenge that we had regarding being a welcoming congregation. And we realized that during the week we weren't very welcoming because if somebody came in the building, you had to go on a hunt to find anybody related to the church, and usually you had to go up to the second floor. So a decision was made to go ahead and bring the administrative offices downstairs so that we could be more welcoming during the week, and people could come in and immediately we could greet them, and if they needed to see the pastors, we could direct them to the area where the pastors were, and we could also bring the pastors together so they could collaborate better instead of Carl's office being way down on the first floor as it was then, and the other pastor's office being all over the place. Now the pastors are together. So that was something that we did, but when we did that, downstairs in the office area, we did partitions and made changes that could be undone if we had to do them because we weren't sure that that was part of the long-range plan. The third thing that's happened is, Jan, remind me what year it was that we purchased the Umstead property. Yeah, it was about 8 years ago. We purchased the property out on Umstead Road, and when we purchased that property, there were actually some drawings on what a facility could look like out there with parking, and it could be a secondary site for the church. And so we did that, but ever since then, we've been wondering, how does a second site fit into the long-range plan of the church? So we haven't done anything other than we've put a beautiful garden out there, And that garden has been a nice mission for us, but we're certainly not utilizing that property to the fullest extent. And so there was something else that happened in the past few months that has spurred us to think a little bit more about our long-range plan. So we recognize we need updates to the facility, right? Everybody's really proud of the fellowship hall, right? Yeah, we need to do something there. And we do need to think about bathrooms, and we need to think about other spaces. So we have some carpet needs and everything, and so we need to do that. But two things that happened was two of our partners that we really enjoy being involved in missions with are the Wesley Foundation and the Scouts Troop 39. And both of them came to us asking to partner with them. First of all, Wesley came to us and said, we're renting property across the street on Franklin Street, and it's not ideal, and we would like the church to consider partnering with us where we can come onto the property, and we can be involved, we can be on the property during the week, and we like having our worship services here, and we'd like to be a part of the church. And we said, that's awesome. And we said, however, when you look at our current facility, it's really not geared toward the type of lounge spaces that college students would like. And so they needed some office space and some lounge space and some worship space. And so we said, well, okay, we could jump in and do that. However, we said, wait, we need to be more intentional about this and think about if we put a lounge space together that's good for the college students during the week, why can't it be good for our youth group on the weekends? And some of the meeting space, the meeting spaces that we have, the lounges that we have, that could be an upgrade for our youth group as well as suit Wesley's needs. And the worship space that they want could fit into maybe a long-range, different type of worship that we could provide here. So let's think about what the church would want and what Wesley wants and try to put that together into something that would suit both. So we need a long-range plan to figure that out. So then the Cub Scout, the Boy Scouts Troop 39 came to us, and they said, we have an opportunity that we'd like for you to think about participating in. They said, we value being a part of the church, but being in the fellowship hall doesn't really work for good meeting space. Plus, we need to store some things, and we need some storage space. And we have a dream of putting together a meeting space off-site somewhere. And we've been looking around Chapel Hill thinking about a site, but our vision is to have an area where you can have a meeting room and some storage area, and it'd be awful neat if maybe the Umstead property could work for that. And then we say, well, that we really like to participate with you, and maybe that would work, but what would we want as a church as sort of a secondary site too for large meeting space? Maybe we'd want it to be convertible for some sort of worship. Maybe we'd want some sort of recreational thing. I don't know, but we need to think about it, and we need to put our heads together collectively as a group and put our wish list together and find out that something that would work for both parties. And the Boy Scouts are interested enough in this to contribute to the building of this as well. I mean, they're not asking us just to go do this. They're asking to be partners and contribute. So with all that said, we've got a lot of thinking to do. And so the time just seemed to be right to get some experts to come in and take a look at this situation. So we, the trustees, have been talking about getting a long-range master facility plan put together. We reached out to several architectural firms. We interviewed a couple firms, and we ended up hiring a company out of Texas, Jackson and Ryan Architects, who had more experience dealing with churches than some of the other ones that we had talked to. Some of the other ones we had talked to more geared towards schools than churches. So we hired Jackson and Ryan, and what was intriguing to us about Jackson and Ryan was their interaction with the congregation. They weren't expecting the trustees to go out and ask everybody what we wanted. Instead, they said, we want to talk to the congregation. We want to talk to the stakeholders. We want to talk to the groups. We want to know what United Methodist Women want to be able to do that the facility is restricting them to do right now. And we want to know what the youth program needs, and we want to know what the worship team needs. And so they're going to talk to staff and program leaders and the groups, and they're also going to talk with Wesley, and they're going to talk with the scouts, and Wesley and the scouts wanted to participate in the study, and we welcome that. And so in the end, we want to figure out how we can utilize both properties that we have and have the most effective ministry for United Methodist Church. And the deliverables from this Jackson and Ryan study will be drawings on how this vision might work, it might look, even some models on how some of these different things can work. And they want to be involved in the communication of this process. And this process isn't something that's going to happen overnight. With the interviewing that's going to occur, we're expecting it to be at least a 6-month process that we're going to get involved within the next month. But you'll see opportunities to speak with Jackson and Ryan Architects and give your input as to what we need out of this facility. And we anticipate what some of the answers will be, and that's fine. But there may be some other things that we learn about that need to be incorporated into this long-range plan. So we're going down that path. It's fairly reasonable as far as I'm concerned. However, if there's some really cool things that come out of it, it's going to flow right into that capital campaign that Adam was talking about, because we may be so excited after we see these results that we've got to get going right away. So we might as well plan now for that capital campaign and be ready for the results that come out of this long-range facility plan.
This is on. All right. Hi, I'm Jenny McGlone. This is Don Bockham. We are your lay leaders, and we're here to talk with you a bit about the results of the survey that you took following General Conference. We're going to give you just some context for it. Then we're going to shoot a lot of numbers at you. Bear with those because we'll give you a chance to ask questions at the end. So I'm going to kick this off by letting Don speak to you all a little bit about just how this all came to be.
Good. Thank you, Jenny. And I always want people to know, our understanding is that this meeting is being videotaped and will be on the web. So just always want people to be aware of that when we're starting. So next slide, if you would. You may not know who your lay leaders are. Well, they're Jenny and me, but what are we supposed to do, which serves sort of as the context for this. And you may not know because we weren't quite certain either, and Justin wasn't either when we moved into this role, so it was one of those where you have to sort of define your job description. Overall, we understand that our role is to try to sort of keep our finger on the pulse of where the congregation is. Not for any particular domain per se, and not representing any particular point of view, but to just try to make sure that we have a good, broad understanding of where our church stands and the congregation stands on a variety of issues. So when these decisions were made recently by the United Methodist Church, we meet with Justin regularly to talk about just various issues in the church. And it became, we thought, very clear, we need to get input from our congregation in terms of our perspectives, our opinions on the decisions that have been made most recently. And so that's why we created this survey. And we won't spend a lot of time on how we constructed the survey, but would like for you to see what those questions were, because we wanted to phrase those in a particular way. Yeah, so if you would switch us to that, and then we'll come back So the three questions that we posed to you that sort of encapsulated what we wanted to get at was, what were the decisions that had been made by the United Methodist Church? And we just wanted to stay with that terminology and those issues as clearly as we could so that we didn't rephrase them in any way. Second, as much as possible, we wanted to know what people felt with regard to this congregation per se. So this first question is, should same-sex marriage ceremonies be allowed within United Methodist Church? We weren't saying Methodist Church in general, but what do we believe we want to have happen here? That was the first question. The second question was, should, quote, self-avowed practicing homosexual individuals be considered for ordination within the United Methodist Church using the same criteria as for other candidates? This was the second issue that was addressed and decisions were made about recently. You'll notice we put this term in quotes. This is not a particularly complimentary phrase, to be honest, as far as I'm concerned. What you'll find is in the whole area of human sexuality, terminology is changing quite a bit. And so hopefully the Methodist Church was not intending to be disrespectful in the term that they chose. But for example, those of us here who are heterosexuals probably wouldn't describe ourselves as self-avowed practicing heterosexual individuals. It's an awkward term. So we wanted to stay with the terminology, however, that was used by the Methodist Church so that we didn't translate it and therefore perhaps alter opinions. And then the third question that we wanted to look at, and this was not part of their decision, but we wanted to start to think about, is there some action as a congregation that we might want to take? So we added this third domain, which was, should UMC consider becoming an official reconciling congregation? And a reconciling congregation is a United Methodist local church that makes a very clear public statement welcoming all persons, regardless of sexual orientation, to participate fully in its congregational life. So notice that question says, should we consider? It didn't say, should we be? Because this would, if our church decided to do this, this would be an issue of a time of discernment. But it was simply, do you believe that we should enter into that discussion and consider that as a possibility? So we created this just 3-item survey as well as an opportunity for people to provide just their own comments that they wanted. And then, Jenny, we sent it out, and you want to take it from there in terms of sort of what we have found at this point?
Yes. So the survey, and my guess is that most of you all completed that. You probably wouldn't be here if you weren't an involved church member. And so, thank you. I also want to give a shout out to John Lusk, who is here, because as we translated the questions into a Google form, Google gave a little bit more permission to accessing the results than was intended. And John, thankfully, very shortly after the email went out, discovered that and helped me problem solve with Google so that we were able to make it a little bit more private than the glitch, whatever the glitch was, had allowed. So thank you, John. So it went out, the link to the Google form went out in an email that goes to 1,170 members on the general church email list. And of that, the 44% was the open rate on that email, the first original email. And then out of everybody that opened that email, 300 people completed the Google form. So we're figuring about a 26% response rate, which we're pretty happy with. It was surprising to see, just even though the link went out in a couple of different emails, it was really that first one that got a lot of activity. We had about 100 responses by the end of the day. So it seemed like there was a lot of enthusiasm around just registering y'all's opinions, which I think is wonderful. Okay, so just some basic demographics of who these 300 responses were. And it was 300, it wasn't like 299. I love that it was such a nice round number. Made the statistics easy. So 90% said that they were church members, 10% non-members. And then the age distribution. So it might be a little hard to see, but I'm going to give you some time to look over that. We grouped. Can't see it at all. Do you want to come on forward? You're welcome to move up. Yeah, I'm going to read these to you. So if you can't see it, then I'll read them slowly, but feel free to move up. All right, so 76 and older, that age category was about 14%. In the 66 to 75 age was 23%.
Here's the 14, 76 and older, 65, 20, 65, 66, 75, 23. Okay.
56 to 65 was 20%. And then moving on down, 46 to 55 was 15%. The next younger group, 36 to 45, was 16%. Age 26 to 35 was 7%. And 14 to 25, that age group was about 5%.
So we felt like we had a pretty good age distribution. It would have been nice to have a larger percentage in the younger age group, perhaps. But overall, we got a pretty good spread of different ages in our congregation.
Can I read any of those out loud again? All right, so let's move on to the next pie chart, which is gender. So we asked the responses that you could select were female, male, non-binary, or prefer not to answer. And we had about 63% women who answered the survey, 34% men. We had 0.7% indicate a non-binary gender, and 2% prefer not to answer. Okay, then next we asked, do you consider yourself a sexual minority? And that was self-defined. We got a yes of 3.5% of people who responded to the survey indicated that they considered themselves a sexual minority, which is not an insignificant number. So then the no's were 96.5.
And that's just a terminology that we recommend perhaps that we use broadly, a term of sexual minority. Again, terms continue to evolve and change, and so you'll hear LGBTQ+, et cetera, and that's changing on an ongoing basis. At least in the domain that I'm aware of, this is a term that most people are comfortable with. Of talking broadly, it's a very heterogeneous term, but sexual minorities can be used as a term that's fairly inclusive. So we just ask people to define for themselves if they consider themselves a part of that large group.
All right, and then these were, as Don has already gone through, the questions that were asked about marriage and ordination and becoming a reconciling church. Okay, so
Jenny,
here,
before you give the answer,
Yep.
just one more thing I would have liked to say about the question. So this is an attitude survey. This was not about actions that we should take. We shouldn't interpret that. This is a mandate of therefore we should do X, Y, or Z. This is really sort of what are your attitudes, what are your opinions. That'll be the next step, is based on this, what actions as a congregation we might choose to take. But this is really just finding out what people's attitudes are.
yes, exactly. Okay. So, let me take you through, and again, feel free to come on up, because this is really where the bread and butter of what we were interested in finding out about our congregation. These were the numbers that I think are the most telling. So, the questions are grouped in columns. So, the first column in each group represents the responses to the marriage question, and then the middle column in each group are responses to the ordination question, and then the third column in each sets along the x-axis, right, honey? That's the x-axis, would be the reconciling. You can be my Vanna White.
I will. So I'm Vanna for today. So let me give you an example of what that is saying in essence. This definitely yes. All these were phrased in the direction of should same-sex marriages be performed in our church? Should practicing homosexuals be allowed to be ordained? Should we consider being a reconciling church? So if there's a 5 here, that is saying yes, strongly agree to each of those. So what these 3 bars are, the first one is, should same-sex marriages be allowed in our church? This is about 75% of people are saying definitely yes. Same with regard to ordination. It's just a little bit higher, probably about 78% saying definitely yes. Should we consider becoming a reconciling church? 78% saying definitely yes. Does that make sense as to how to read this figure? Because this is really the crux of the results, all the way down to definitely not for any of those. And you can see for all 3 questions, it's at 10% or a bit lower with regard to definitely not for each of those 3 items. So is this clear, how to make sense of these bar graphs? Okay,
Thank you.
certainly.
And so if you kind of think about, so what does that mean about our church? Are there general conclusions we can draw from this data? I would say yes. I would venture to say that it is pretty clear that we are a congregation that wants to include all, that we want to embrace LGBTQ plus members. We want to perform marriages. We want these folks to lead us as ordained clergy. And that this is a pretty strong result. This isn't sort of an up and down and you've got a balance on both ends. These responses are clearly weighted towards the 4s and 5s, which are yes, and the definitely yes. To me, this is a really strong result. To me, this allows the leadership of our church to move forward, understanding that while we do have some members whose opinions we want to honor and listen to and respect, that as a church whole, we are letting our opinions be known that we are in favor of inclusion. I did also, just as an interesting more for me, because you also, 96% of you all left comments, and there wasn't a way to statistically analyze those, but I did cut and paste them into a word count program, and the top 4 words that were used most often in the comments were church, and then all, and then love, and then should, which to me makes a really beautiful sentence. Church should love all. So, what are you all's questions?
Just one more piece of information. Again, we didn't statistically analyze it, but Jan Sassman nicely, and Jenny as well, looked to see if this differed by age group in terms of the opinions and so forth and the various responses that we got. Tiny little variations, but it's really not notable. It looks like the mean scores might be a little bit higher for that 26 to 35-year-old age group. That's also a very small sample. That was a group that we didn't get as many responses from, but it's not as if older or younger people have very differing opinions on these issues. This looks like it sort of cuts across the age span of people who responded to the survey. Now, 25%, there's still 75% that didn't respond, but with survey research, this is pretty good. It's not unusual when you just send something out like this. You may get 10, 15%. So I don't know how much we can say this fully represents our entire congregation, but that's a pretty good response rate.
Joan, let's get this on the recording, please.
Do you have any idea how to account for the low numbers of younger people that responded? Why do we have so few in those 2 younger categories? Do we know?
The 36 and under, or the 26 and under. I mean,
And then wasn't there a lower one than that, a younger one than that even?
there's 14 to 25.
I'm surprised that more of those folks didn't respond.
Yeah, I don't know if it reflects our demographics in the congregation, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in some ways it does reflect some of the demographics. For instance, for that 14 to 25, Charlie made sure that our youth had that. Our youth who have email addresses that we have had the survey. And so when I say how it reflects that demographic, so, my kiddo, my oldest, who's now a teenager, we just lectured him today for having 90 unread emails in his email. I mean, it's just not the thing that he goes to check. So you have some of that phenomenon in there as well. But a lot of that percentage that we did get was from that demographic. By and large, the people who generally speaking, click on our emails and are really trying to access our information and engage are the people that you saw larger percentages from there. I mean, it's how we tend to operate. So maybe we need to do more to activate some of the 35 and younger crowd. It typically works that way for us. As far as responses.
In the larger community, the older you are, the less likely you are to favor these responses. So I think if there was any skewing, it would have mitigated against this result, which reinforces it in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You were saying that in the general population, older individuals often would be less likely to endorse those 4s and 5s. And the fact that we did not see that in this congregation probably is a fairly striking kind of a finding. Is that a fair restatement?
This might be a hard question to answer, but any course of action this congregation takes has to be done on an actual vote, I guess, of active members. Do you have any idea how the actual membership of the congregation feels in contrast to the ones who responded to this survey?
We don't. This was, not in a formal basis, which is why we wanted to do the survey, because we each have our own groups we interact with, and you can come away with a very skewed perspective of this is how people in the church feel about it. So this is really the initial data that we have. And again, we certainly have not tried to define what that next step was. We felt like we just needed to find out where are people on this, and then clearly we start to think as a congregation, how does this get translated into our next steps?
Right. And I think the data that we received here really does reflect the conversations I've had within our congregation, and so it resonates with me. After we do a little Q&A here, I'll talk a bit about what I think are a couple next steps for us in the congregation, and some of the things that we've talked about at church council as well as looking at some of the things that are going on in the larger denomination.
Cynthia and I, is this on? We've been members here since 1966. And so had this survey been taken, it may well have been flipped. In other words, I'm suggesting that what I know is that stuff on the I write would be over the other way. And so every 5-10 years it would have changed. And that tells me that we, in my own attitudes, were never so sharply backward, but they have changed as well. And so I'm suggesting that we find a way to encourage those who may feel left out of this survey and make them know that they are respected and appreciated at University United Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlie. Very good.
I think the whole message we're getting here is one of inclusion. So we certainly want to make sure that because you did not respond to the survey, your opinions are not heard and valued.
One observation coming new to university, or new and old, but having come from a congregation that did vote to become a reconciling congregation, one of the difficulties that we found was that despite months and months and months and months of discussion, when it came time for a vote, the vote was not, even though the discussions sounded like this, the vote was 55-45 or even closer. And that is a disturbing place to be, even if you agree with what's voted for, you're then aware that there were people who did not feel heard in the discussions, and when it came time to vote, voted no. And so I would just come as a caution from that. I'd like to think that we've, that's been a number of years, and that things have changed and that we are changing, but that these numbers might very well not reflect an actual vote.
Right. I think thank you for that. And, I've known congregations that have voted for being a reconciling congregation that were about 63%. And that is almost splits the church, even at that percentage. And so, again, I'll say more about what I think the way forward is there related to reconciling congregations in a moment, but I think that's a wonderful thing to be, or we should be mindful of your comment moving forward. Yeah. Pat?
Even though my feeling is at the high end there, I found myself not giving all the answers, the high numbers, mainly because I was concerned about what this would do for our ministers, our clergy, about our finances, some of those things. And that's, I don't know whether my true feelings, I projected those or not. But anyway, that's why I did not do all the high numbers. I did on some of the questions, but not all.
I actually have a practical question about what all this means. So if there was a couple that wanted to get married in this church and use their own minister from another, you figured this was coming. If they wanted to use their own minister, could we allow it? What is the risk if we did allow it? And second, if a minister who's on staff here decided that they would church would go somewhere and marry a couple who is same-sex, what would be the risk to those people? And I think we really need to understand what those risks are, and
Thank you.
And I'm not sure it's really been explained.
Thank you. That's really good. So this answer there are two different answers. One is the answer between now and January 1, 2020. And then there is the January 1, 2020 moving forward. And the January 2020 moving forward is a more intense form of today's answer. So today, as it has stood in the United Methodist Church, if I were to, we'll work through a couple scenarios, if I were to preside over a wedding here of LGBTQ plus couple, and then somebody from wherever in Methodism heard about it, I could be then reported to the district superintendent and bishop, and then they would have to determine how to investigate those charges and then what kind of trial could result. So the more extreme end of it, we go through a church trial. It's determined that I did, in fact, perform the wedding, and then the bishop and others determine what the consequences are, because it's not allowable by current church discipline to perform such a wedding. And so I've known people to have 1 hour with no pay suspensions. And I've known people to have their ministerial credentials removed. That's what can happen. If a local church were to say, well, we're going to allow a wedding to be done in our church, I'm going to have one of my friends, I had just had a friend offer to do this the other day. He's just become an Episcopal priest. He said, look, you got people, you need weddings done, I'll do your weddings. And if it were done on church property, sometimes today that could be a chargeable offense as well. Sometimes Episcopal leaders have let it happen. So really, in some cases, depends on the preferences of your bishop. If we were to do a wedding off-site, we could absolutely do a congregational wedding off-site with my Episcopal priest friend, and today I might be able to do a prayer or something and get away with it. But in 2020, no. And in January 1 of 2020, absolutely no weddings performed by individuals, United Methodist clergy, in United Methodist spaces. And I would not be able to participate in any form of blessing of a ceremony outside of this church as well. So it's the consequences are similar, but more harsh, and it's more of an expedient process to remove somebody like me if I were to perform or be part of, or if our church were to allow any of those ceremonies. So does that, and
So the Book of Discipline nerd, there is a minimum penalty that's coming into effect on January 1st, 2020. Minimum penalty of a chargeable offense, say Justin were to officiate at a same-sex wedding, or I were, or Toby, Daniel, Charlie. Minimum penalty for your first offense is 1 year suspension without pay. For your second offense, it's termination of your conference membership and revocation of your ministerial credentials. Those are the minimum penalties that will go into effect on January 1st, 2020. They do not currently exist as minimum penalties.
And again, minimum penalty. It could be, that's the minimum. It could be, you could move to a maximum pretty quickly, dependent on your bishop and the culture around you. Yes, follow up.
So I guess the last question, is there any restriction on baptism?
Good question.
You got to ask all three. So
That's right.
Or funerals, or
That's right. So this is what some of us would argue a great inconsistency in the life of our church. I can baptize anybody I want to baptize. I can do funerals for anybody I want to do funerals for. Anyone can become a member of our church and serve in any leadership capacity they want to, except for ordination. And all of those are possible. And with the exception, here again, of ordination, kind of pulling that out, and then marriage, pulling that out. But everything else is allowable, permissible within the life of the church. So you point out an inconsistency in our church's life. Let's go here. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, when you talked to us about the decision after you got back from the delegation, I thought there was a chance that this 2020 decision may change. Is that not so, Justin?
Yes. So the Judicial Council met this month, and what they were meeting on were two major items. One, whether this traditional plan would go into effect, and then two, a disaffiliation plan. That's if a United Methodist Church wanted to leave the denomination. So those were the two plans. And though there were portions, smaller portions of the traditional plan that were unconstitutional, all that we've talked about, the major decisions in the traditional plan were upheld. And so that's why they do go into effect. However, also, the disaffiliation plan was also upheld. And so that is an option that actually goes into effect now rather than in 2020. Yes.
So I may be placing the cart way before the horse here, but if we were to decide to disaffiliate, I gather it would be a pretty expensive proposition. So I'm wondering, has any financial planning been started on that? Are people considering what it would look like, and how much would it cost us?
Right. So so there is a payout. You pay your year's apportionments, and then the coming year's apportionment, and that's the payout for it. And so it that's certainly an expense. However, I take it if our congregation chose to do that, we would find a way to make that possible. We have not. So this plan was just approved week before last year, and so we've not talked about any of that in finance or in church council. But I imagine that will be a conversation moving forward. But also don't want to say to anyone that we are actively making plans to leave the denomination today. Yeah.
Justin, when I look at these numbers, I know that the questions are a little tentative, but I do not see a 45% congregation. We know who we are as a congregation, and I think those numbers show that. We are not a homophobic Wesley Covenant Association, non-inclusive congregation. But the way the denomination is structured and will be so in 2020, and as far as I can tell, for the considerably long-range future, we are going to be forced to be in positions that we as a church don't support. I hope we get a new Methodist denomination that our congregation will be a part of. It's going to be difficult, expensive, all of those things. It's going to require a lot of courage, but we've got a lot of courageous clergy in our denomination, and we have a church, I think, that could really thrive even more in a totally inclusive denomination. I do have a name for the denomination. the Methodist Church. It was a good name from 1939 to 1968, and it would do us well now.
Thank you, Christian. Actually, this is a great segue into some comments about a way forward. So let me make some of these comments, and then if we have additional questions, we can go from there. So as we think about, Church Council has met and talked, and we do believe that on our website we should have language helping the community to know that we are a welcoming church. We've been talking about it for long before General Conference, and we'll continue to talk about it long after. And so we'll be working on some language that would be meaningful to include on the website. Related to becoming a reconciling congregation, there are a couple different things. One, anybody can go online today and ask to be made a reconciling individual. So that's something you can do today to begin to receive information from Reconciling Ministries Network. As it relates to a congregational process, It takes about a year. It is more of a congregational vote. And one of the things that I was concerned about when I arrived, there were, within my first 2 weeks, probably 10 to 12 people asked if we were going to get around to becoming a reconciling congregation. I said, I've been here 2 weeks. And I just thought this, with all the things to do within year one of ministry, and then knowing the special session of General Conference was coming up, I just thought that might be one too many things for us to work on, because it does take time, concerted energy. The upside is you can put that official label on the website. The downside is you have church members that feel like they vote against one another. And every other context I've been in where this has happened, it feels that way. And so we'd want to find ways to mitigate that. I do think that we have this is really strong. And so the folks who might feel more left out could be in a smaller minority, but in the spirit of kinship, we believe in not leaving anybody out. And so trying to figure out how to be in ministry to everyone who's part of our University Church family is important. So now one of the things that Church Council is thinking about that question, also thinking about that we're engaging currently mostly through my work at a more denominational level is these conversations, the conversation that's happening at the end of this month in Kansas, and the focus of that conversation is how do we move forward, those who are like-minded with this congregation, how do we move forward? Do we try to continue to work from within? Is there a way strategically between now and the spring 2020 General Conference, the General Conference that's on our more traditional 4-year pattern, is there a way to begin to create some new efforts to renew from within and give the North American Methodist context more flexibility, just as we were hoping to have in the One Church plan? So that's one question that's before us. And I've already heard from members of our congregation who said, I would actually prefer that work from within. So there are people who are right here who think work from within. The other is, let's just start something new. Let's create a coalition, a broad coalition of churches. Remember, 63% of American Methodists voted for the One Church plan, which would create more flexibility. So to create a broad coalition within that 63% to see if a new North American Methodist denomination could be formed. It's not that new North American Methodist denomination wouldn't completely disaffiliate with, because there are good things that happen in other places where United Methodism exists that we support heartily. Think about the German Methodist Church, and their posture and stance has been way over here. They've basically said, we don't care what the General Conference has said. We're going to continue to be an open and inclusive branch of the United Methodist Church. And so, there are ways to still maintain certain kinds of connection even while being differentiated. And so it remains to be seen which of those directions. However, over the next year or so, as a congregation, we're going to need to be having conversations that keep us, that help us to continue to move forward and to know what decisions we might need to make at a local level to affiliate with one of these ways forward. And so one of the concerns that we're still talking about in church council, it's really fresh, is, so do we have enough congregational bandwidth to be talking about renewing the North American context or starting a new the nomination, which I talked to my wife Chaka about that, and she said, "Oh my gosh, that sounds like a lot of work." So, do we have bandwidth as a congregation to work on that and also work the reconciling ministries process, or would we somehow diminish both processes by doing them essentially at the same time? We've really got to think about this. I mean, we certainly know, and Church Council absolutely affirms where we are here and believes that we want to find ourselves into in a Methodist context that allows us to have all the flexibility and the inclusiveness that we want as a congregation. And we are trying to figure out what it means to do that wisely and smartly. So after I should have a clearer picture that I can communicate to Church Council and communicate to the congregation following this meeting that's happening May 20th through 22nd in Kansas. That may help us figure out, okay, how do we engage in each of these conversations? If this next Methodism thing looks like a 5-year, 6-year horizon, makes perfect sense to engage in the reconciling conversations now. If that looks like a 1 to 2 year horizon, well, then, I mean, we just might as well create a reconciling denomination. And so that's really what we're trying to think about related to those questions. So with that, any additional questions on these matters? Do we have a microphone?
I have one.
Oh, okay.
You basically answered my question. It was about reconciling congregations.
All right, thank you.
I still have a question
Yes.
along that timeline,
Mm-hmm.
because that was part of, I think,
Right.
our questions, and you've segued into that. It seems to me the confusion in my head, because I tend to look at bigger pictures.
Right, yes.
It has to do with this timeline,
Mm-hmm.
is that, and because unfortunately we seem to have winners and losers in this conversation, and that's just what it is. So if the winners are saying, oh, well, but we want this taken care of on January 1st, 2020, and all of a sudden it's ours.
Mm-hmm.
And those of you who want to leave, just leave.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty short timeline between now and January 1st, 2020 to have this. So I'm sure as part of the conversation, hopefully those of like minds that you're going to
Yes.
have in Kansas at this
Yes.
time will answer some of those questions.
Absolutely.
But there's a million questions, correct?
Right.
So how is General Conference in 2020 going to deal with this to say, no, we're not going to, because there's one thing that I was reading, some bishop said, oh, well, if 2/3 of the congregation, that was sort of her take, have this and vote to disaffiliate, then, but it still has to be approved by annual conference. And well, whose annual conference?
Right, yeah.
So that to me is
Yes.
some of the logistical
Yes.
things that I'm sure y'all have already dealt with. And,
Right.
But it just seems to me there needs to be a delay to some point to say, this can't all happen.
Right. A couple things. So one, so a general conference the decisions of a general conference are reflective only of the delegates that are there at a general conference. And so if there are different voting habits in annual conferences this summer, then you could get a shift at General Conference 2020. And general conferences are sovereign, so they could completely undo the special session if they wanted to. I mean, this is part of the messiness of it. I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm saying that it could indeed happen. There are churches that are part of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, was mentioned before, more of a traditionalist posture, that are creating plans for disaffiliation even after the, if you want to say, win of the special sessions vote. So there are advocates of the traditional plan that are planning on leaving anyway. And so There's a lot to think about, and there are a lot of questions, and more questions than I even know. But right now, the plan is to see what shift could happen in the spring of 2020, and what's the likelihood of that shift. And based on the likelihood of that shift, different strategies will emerge. You know, our church, University Methodist Church, would only be affected if we collectively decided that we were going to live in a posture of principled disobedience to the discipline in 2020. And then we'd have another decision, how much bandwidth we can take with all of our clergy being in trouble all the time. You know, lay leaders having to start preach or something like that because the rest of us are wrapped up in trials. So, you know, these are the things to be thinking about and to be concerned about on a forward basis. But all of those things we're going to try to think about, or as many of those things as possible, in the May meeting. All right, I think me. So there's maybe a couple more questions, and then we're going to need to
see if I can articulate
shift.
this. It seems that there's a little missing piece of the conversation, at least for me. And I'm playing a little bit off of what Charlie talked about earlier, a little bit off of what Rita was just mentioning. Many of us grow up, myself included. If you would have asked me these questions 5 years ago, it would have been very different. And I've struggled and searched to learn, and my views have changed. So, and that was a process that I had to go through. It took study. It took some, determination to do it, without a lot of tools, by the way, that were provided. And I think that that's maybe something that we could, I don't know how you do that, but it seems like we could do a better job of helping people that are hung up on Romans 1:26 to get over it, and to look at all of the contrast, even in Paul's writings, that they want to hang their hat on one thing but accept another. And if people can personally get through that knothole, then this whole thing starts to go away. I mean, there's always going to be people, no matter what. That's not going to change, okay? We're not going to save them. God bless them. But for the rest of us, how do we help there?
Right. So, as many of you, or some of you will remember, this congregation, 20 years ago, went through a conversation around human sexuality that Pastor Gaddis led, and it was very helpful for many members of the community. And we talked about at church council whether this kind of, we felt like we should have some kind of learning journey. So whether we make it an official reconciling ministries process with a vote at the end of a time, or we begin a learning journey that looks very similar, we think that we should begin to engage in that sometime over this next 6 months or so. And so, because I do think that that's important. And some have even said, I'm just struggling to understand, well, my siblings here in the church that fit more on this side. I think that's important for us to be able to have meaningful conversations as a congregational family. And so we'll find ways to do that over these next 6 months with materials. Or maybe I'll just call Gaddis in and say, hey, buddy, favor. All right, one more question.
Frivolous thing to say, but could you become a Presbyterian minister and preach in our church? If you got discipline. I mean, we can come up with ways to respectfully disobey.
I've got one of my best friends. I don't have, I've just got a small set of best friends that I check in with on an almost daily basis. One of them was a Methodist who became a Methodist in our congregation in Houston as I invited him to come and be our youth minister, and then went to Duke Divinity School and then became an ordained Methodist minister. And he is just as of May 1st become an Episcopal priest because he started a church, kind of like Pastor Daniel's doing, started a church, a huge LGBTQ plus community, and only a couple of those members had formerly been Methodist. And they said, look, we have no stake in this Methodist thing. You do, but we don't, so we're going to be a church that's not that. So we'd love it if you'd come along with us or lead us into that, and if not, we don't know what we're going to do. So they became, over what felt like overnight, an Episcopal congregation. And he became an Episcopal priest. You know, these things happen, and but that is not the path we're on right now. Besides, Elizabeth Marie next door would be quite cross with me if there were two Episcopal churches right next to one another on Franklin Street. You know, Methodists do that kind of thing. We're in proximity to one another, but Episcopalians just don't. So, but there will be a way forward, and we'll continue to talk about it as we have more information. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful session. And the last thing I want to say is, and you heard from them, we have an amazing set of lay leaders. And I'm just talking about our official lay leaders, but, chair of church council, chair of trustees, lay leaders. We have an amazing set of leaders here. And I am so very thankful that in this season of my ministry, in this season of life in the United Methodist Church, that I have these great folks working with me, and that I'm here with all of you. So thank you, and we'll keep on moving forward together. Blessings. Bye.